Moving on to Transcendental Doctrine of Elements, second part, Transcendental Logic, Introduction, the idea of a transcendental logic. So I watched Victor Gijsbers' lecture on this. I hope I have like a relatively good understanding of this, and I'm going to try to go to section 4, I think, of this, which is about 10 pages. Section 1, Logic in general. Our knowledge springs from two fundamental sources of our mind. The first is to receive representations, receptivity of impressions. The second is the faculty of knowing an object through these representations. Spontaneity of concepts. The second is the faculty of knowing an object through these spontaneity of concepts. Okay. Through the first, the reception of representations, an object is given to us. Through the second, the object is thought in relation to that representation, which is a mere determination of the mind. Intuition and concepts constitute, therefore, the elements of all of our knowledge, effectively meaning like what's presented to us and what's thought about those presentations. Okay. The elements of our knowledge, so that neither concepts without an intuition in some way corresponding to them, nor intuition without concepts can yield knowledge. Both are either pure or empirical. They are empirical when they contain sensation. Sensation presupposes the actual presence of the object. They are pure when no sensation is mixed in with the representation. Sensation may be called the matter of sensible knowledge. Pure intuition, therefore, contains only the form under which something is intuited, and the pure concept contains only the form of thinking an object in general. Okay. Pure intuition, therefore, contains only the form under which something is intuited. So would that be space and time? And the pure concept contains only the form of thinking an object in general. Pure intuitions and pure concepts alone are possible a priori. Empirical intuitions and empirical concepts only a posteriori. Makes sense. We call sensibility the receptivity of our mind to receive representations insofar as it is in some wise affected, while the understanding, on the other hand, is our faculty of producing representations by ourselves, or the spontaneity of knowledge. Okay, that makes sense. So, sensibility is receiving information, then understanding uses that information to spontaneously, effectively, like through ideas and stuff, produce actual knowledge. We are so constituted that our intuition can never be other than sensible. That is, it contains only the mode in which we are affected by objects. The faculty, on the contrary, which enables us to think the object of sensible intuition, is the understanding. Okay. Intuition is related to like what's actually received through the senses, and then thinking, the understanding is what allows us to experience an intuition in our minds. Neither of those properties is to be preferred to the other. Without sensibility, no object would be given to us. Without understanding, no object would be thought. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. It's like a famous quote, I think. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. It is therefore just as necessary. So just to tease that out a little bit. Thoughts without content are empty, meaning if you're thinking things and there's not like a corollary in reality that it's related to, it's just kind of pure content that's untethered to anything meaningful. It's completely empty. And then intuitions without concepts. So like thinking of things, like experience without actually being able to categorize, understand, think about things, would just be like kind of pure sense experience. And without the ability to categorize it or understand it or think about it or extrapolate, it's totally useless. It would just be a blur of sense data. At least that's my understanding. It is therefore just as necessary to make our concepts sensible, i.e., to add the object to them in intuition, as to make our intuitions understandable, i.e., to bring them under concepts. These two faculties or capacities cannot exchange their functions. The understanding cannot intuit anything, and senses cannot think anything. Only from their union can knowledge arise. And if I remember correctly, I think that they have some sort of like kind of symbiotic relationship for Kant. Like, I mean, that's kind of what he's describing here. But they're kind of like an infinite feedback loop that is necessary for us to really do anything meaningful, I guess. Okay. But this is no reason for confounding their respective contributions. Rather, it gives us strong reason for carefully separating and distinguishing them, the one from the other. We therefore distinguish the science of rules of sensibility in general, i.e. the aesthetic, which we already talked about, which is like intuitions and, things that are presented to us as appearances, from the science of rules of the understanding in general, i.e. the logic. So that's the use of our mind, which we're going to kind of talk about in this next section. Logic, again, can be undertaken from two viewpoints, either as logic of the general or as logic of the particular use of the understanding. The former, the general, contains the absolutely necessary rules of thought, without which the understanding cannot be used at all. It therefore treats of the understanding without any regard to the difference between the objects to which it is directed. Right. It's kind of basic, basic logic of the world, which is like kind of separate and apart from any particular objects. The logic of the particular use of the understanding contains the rules for how to think correctly about a certain kind of objects. Okay? The former may be called elementary logic, the latter the organon of this or that science. So an organon for Kant is like the ability of using logic in order to like extrapolate and understand things in the world. At least that's my understanding, based on the Gijsbers lecture I watched earlier. The latter is generally taught in the organon. The latter is generally taught in the schools as a propedeutic to the sciences, though according to the actual progress of human reason, it comes last and is obtained when the science itself has long been completed. I think that's a typo. And requires only a few finishing touches by way of correction and perfection. For the objects of that science must already be known to a fairly high degree before it is possible to state the rules according to which a science of them may be established. General logic is either pure or applied. Okay. In the former, pure, I like to just note that because former and latter, I never like using it. It just say the thing to make it easier. it's slightly forgivable when you do former and then latter, but like sometimes I'm writing stuff or reading stuff and it's like talking about the latter first and then I don't know. It's a little overused in my opinion. In the former, we abstract. So this is general logic. So general logic is either pure or applied. So this is pure, actually, we're talking about. In the former, we abstract all empirical conditions under which we exercise our understanding, e.g., from the influence of the senses, the play of the imagination, the laws of memory, the force of habit, inclination, etc., and therefore also from the sources of prejudice. Okay. And indeed, from all the causes that may give rise, or may seem to give rise, to this or that knowledge. For all these empirical conditions concern the understanding only under certain circumstances of its application, and experience is required in order to know these circumstances. A logic that is general, but also pure, has to deal only with a priori principles, and is a canon of the understanding and of reason, though only with regard to what is formal in our use of them, irrespective of the content, whether empirical or transcendental. So my understanding of this is like, something like this would be kind of like a universal truth, like the law of non-contradiction is the example that Professor Gijsbers uses, like A cannot be true and also not true at the same time. And it's really not helpful necessarily for like only insofar as like making sure things don't fall into that bucket, but it's not really helpful for like telling you anything specific about the world or your experience, because you know that's all it can really tell you is that one thing, and it can't really be extrapolated from. But anyway, general logic is called applied if it is directed to the rules of the use of our understanding under the subjective empirical conditions laid down in psychology. So applied kind of takes into account human experience, like human. Kant gave a list of the things, laws of memory, force of habit, a play of imagination, etc. So I think that's what he's saying. Applied, actually. So pure doesn't take into account that stuff. Applied does take into account that stuff. General logic is called applied if it is directed to the rules of our use of our understanding under the subjective empirical conditions laid down in psychology. Such a logic, therefore, has empirical principles, although it is general insofar as it refers to the use of the understanding, whatever its objects may be. For this reason, it is neither a canon of the understanding, nor, in general, nor an organon of particular sciences, but simply a cathartic of the common understanding. Cathartic, Professor Gijsbers said at least, was kind of like a use of something to kind of pressure test certain ideas and to maybe get rid of bad ideas. So, when we use applied logic, we would be kind of trying to weed out, again, those things that we talked about, memory, imagination, probably bias, and try to weed out things that aren't helpful or useful given our experience. And that's what a kind of a cathartic is. An organon, again, is something that you can extrapolate from, and we use logic to kind of to build on stuff and to flesh things out. And a canon, I think, is like kind of those very basic laws, like the law of non-contradiction, where we're saying we're saying certain truths about the world that may apply to certain things or not certain things, but aren't really used to kind of understand things in particular. It's just kind of a general rule that may tell us one thing about a certain situation, but really is more just like a general truth of logic, like the law of non-contradiction. In general logic, therefore, that part which is to constitute the pure doctrine of reason must be entirely separated from that which constitutes applied, though still general logic. The former alone is, properly speaking, a science, though short and dry, as the proper exposition of a doctrine of the elements of the understanding ought to be. In this logic, therefore, logicians must never lose sight of two rules. As general logic, it abstracts from all content in the knowledge of the understanding and from all differences between its objects, and deals with nothing but the mere form of thought. Okay. As pure logic, it has nothing to do with empirical principles, and borrows nothing from psychology, as some have imagined. And so psychology has no influence whatever on the canon of the understanding. Pure logic is a demonstrated doctrine, and everything in it must be certain completely a priori. What I call applied logic, contrary to the ordinary meaning of this expression, according to which it should contain certain exercises for which pure logic gives the rule, is a representation of the understanding and of the rules of its necessary use in concreto, i.e., under the contingent conditions of the subject, which may hinder or help in this use, and which are all given only empirically. This is applied logic. It makes sense. It treats of attention, its impediments and consequences, of the source of error, of the state of doubt, hesitation and conviction, etc. Pure general logic stands to it in the same relation as pure ethics. Pure general logic, which contains only the necessary moral laws of a free will in general, stands to the proper doctrine of virtue. The doctrines of virtue consider these laws as under the influence of feelings, inclinations, and passions to which all human beings are more or less subject. Such a doctrine can never constitute a true and demonstrated science, because, like applied logic, it depends on empirical and psychological principles. Okay, got some terminology down. Kind of makes sense. That's the end of that section. Section 2, of Transcendental Logic. General logic, as we have shown, abstracts from all content of knowledge, i.e., from all relation of knowledge to its object, and considers only the logical form in the relation of knowledge to other knowledge. That is, it treats the form of thought in general, which kind of makes sense. It's kind of the basic building blocks of logic. So it's not going to have, like, particular application, but it's really kind of going to be, just formal rules for how we understand the world. But since, as the Transcendental aesthetic shows, there are pure as well as empirical intuitions, excuse me, it is possible that a similar distinction be encountered between pure and empirical thought of objects. In that case, we should have a logic in which we do not abstract from all content of knowledge. While that logic which contains merely the rules of pure thought of an object would exclude all knowledge with a merely empirical content. It would also treat the origin of our knowledge of objects, as far as that origin cannot be attributed to the objects, while general logic is not at all concerned with the origin of our knowledge, but only considers representations, whether existing originally a priori in ourselves, or given only empirically, according to the laws used by the understanding when, in thinking, it treats them in their relation to one another. It deals therefore only with that form of the understanding which can be imparted to the representations, whatever their origin may be. I gotta read that again. But since the Transcendental aesthetic shows there are pure as well as empirical intuitions, right? It is possible that a similar distinction be encountered between pure empirical thought of objects. Pure and empirical thought of objects. So pure thought, kind of like in your mind's eye, presumably in your imagination, thinking something empirical, like a thought based on experience, like specifically recalling an experience or something. Is that what that means? Okay. In that case, we should have a logic in which we do not abstract from all content of knowledge. Okay. Because we're using some of that content for the empirical side, presumably. While that logic which contains merely the rules of pure thought of an object would exclude all knowledge with a mere empirical content. Okay, that makes sense. It would also treat of the origin of our knowledge of objects, as far as that origin cannot be attributed to the objects. Right, because that's empirical. It also treat of the origin of our knowledge. Okay. While general logic is not at all concerned with the origin of our knowledge, that makes sense, because kind of the origin of our knowledge is based on experience, and general logic is kind of more foundational, and that's kind of particular. But only considers representations, whether existing originally a priori in ourselves or given only empirically, according to the laws used by the understanding when, in thinking, it treats them in their relation to one another. It deals, therefore, only with that form of the understanding which can be imparted to the representations, whatever their origin may be. It deals, therefore, only with the form of the understanding which can be imparted to the representations. Okay, I'm not 100% following exactly what that means, but I'm going to move on, because Here I make a remark which should never be lost sight of, as it extends its influence over all that follows. Not every kind of a priori knowledge should be called transcendental. Only that kind by which we know that, and how certain representations, intuitions, or concepts can be used or are possible completely a priori, should be called transcendental. That is, the a priori possibility or the a priori use of knowledge. And so Kant, is making the point here that, there's a lot of stuff that's a priori, including, geometry and some other stuff that's not transcendental. But when he's talking about transcendental, my understanding is he's talking about what is possible for us to either have as intuitions with a transcendental aesthetic, or as concepts with a transcendental logic. Like, what are we able to know a priori about those things? That's transcendental. Not necessarily things about, certain facts about those things that we can surmise, or truths that we can surmise a priori. Again, he's mostly concerned with like the a priori aspect of us, more so than like the actual factual things we can learn and maybe surmise a priori. Neither space, therefore, nor any a priori geometrical determination of it is a transcendental representation. But we may rightly call transcendental only the knowledge that these representations are not at all of empirical origin, and the possibility that they can yet refer a priori to objects of experience. The application of space to objects in general would likewise be transcendental. The application of space to objects in general, right, like the nature of space, like we talked about in the Transcendental Aesthetic, would likewise be transcendental. But, if restricted only to objects of the senses, it is empirical. The distinction between transcendental and the empirical belongs therefore only to the critique of knowledge, and does not concern the relation of that knowledge to its object. In the expectation, therefore, that there may perhaps be concepts referring a priori to objects, not as pure or sensible intuitions, but merely as acts of pure thought, being concepts in fact, but neither of empirical nor of aesthetic origin, we form in advance the idea of a science of pure understanding and of pure rational knowledge, whereby we think objects entirely a priori. So that's, I think, effectively what the transcendental logic is. So just to make sure I completely, well, maybe not completely understand that, but to make sure I understand that, I'm going to reread it. In the expectation, therefore, that there may perhaps be concepts referring a priori to objects, not as pure or sensible intuitions, but merely as acts of pure thought. Okay, so we can have thoughts that a priori refer to objects merely as acts of thought. They aren't based on like sense data. Being concepts in fact, but neither of empirical, so experience, nor aesthetic, not really sure, origin. We form in advance the idea of a science of pure understanding and of pure rational knowledge, whereby we think objects entirely a priori. Okay, so like, do we have the ability to think something entirely a priori, like separate and apart from the transcendental aesthetic and empirical experience? Like, what do we have that we, what is our ability to do that, and what can it do? Such a science, which would determine the origin, the range, and the objective validity of such knowledge, would have to be called transcendental logic. Okay, I had to take a break. Not 100% sure where I left off. But, okay. Such a science which would determine the origin, the range, and the objective validity of such knowledge would have to be called transcendental logic. For it deals with the laws of the understanding and of reason only insofar as they are referred a priori to objects, and not, like general logic, insofar as they are referred indiscriminately to empirical as well as pure rational knowledge. Section 3. Of the division of general logic into analytic and dialectic. What is truth? Is an old and famous question by which people thought they could drive logicians into a corner and either make them take refuge in a pitiful circular reasoning or make them confess their ignorance and consequently the vanity of their whole art. These people took for granted and presuppose the nominal definition of truth, that is, the agreement that it is the agreement of knowledge with its object. But they wanted to know the general and safe criterion for the truth of any and every knowledge. To know that question may reasonably be asked is already a great and necessary proof of sagacity and insight. For if a question is absurd in itself and calls for unnecessary answers, it not only brings disgrace to the person raising it, but may prompt an incautious listener to give absurd answers, thus presenting, as the ancients said, the laughable spectacle of one person milking a he-goat and another holding the sieve underneath. Weird. Okay. I'm not going to overthink that metaphor. If truth consists in the agreement of knowledge with its object, then the object must thereby be distinguished from other objects. For knowledge is false if it does not agree with the object to which it is referred, even if it contains something which may be valid of other objects. Okay. Now a general criterion of truth would be one that is valid for all knowledge, whatever its objects may be. But it is clear that such a criterion abstracts from all contents of knowledge reference to its object, while truth concerns these very contents. It is impossible and absurd, therefore, to ask for a sign of the truth of such contents, and therefore a sufficient and at the same time general indicator of truth cannot possibly be given. Okay, so truth has to be particular, because general things don't apply to a specific object, and, if it doesn't apply to a specific object, then it isn't necessarily a truth of it, even if it may in effect actually apply to it. If you're just saying something generally, the fact that it happens to be true about the object doesn't necessarily make it a truth. I think that's kind of what he's saying. As we have already entitled the content of knowledge its matter, we will have to say that of the truth of knowledge, as far as its matter is concerned, no general indicator can be demanded. Sorry, I read that really poorly and did not understand it. As we have already entitled the content of knowledge its matter, the content of knowledge is its matter, we will have to say that the truth of knowledge, as far as its matter is concerned, no general indicator can be demanded, because such an indicator would be intrinsically self-contradictory. Okay, what? No general indicator could be demanded, because such an indicator would be intrinsically self-contradictory. Because it would be specific and general at the same time, so it would be a self-contradiction. Is that what he means? I'm not really sure. Okay. But, as regards knowledge with respect to its mere form, leaving aside all content, it is equally clear that logic, as it puts forth the general and necessary rules of understanding, must in these very rules furnish criteria of truth. For whatever contradicts those rules is false, because the understanding would thereby contradict its general rules of thought, that is, contradict itself. These criteria, I think he's kind of referring to the, general logic principles like principle of non-contradiction and stuff like that. And in that case, that makes total sense. These criteria, however, concern only the form of truth, that is, of thought in general, and to this extent they are quite correct. But they are not sufficient, for although our knowledge may be entirely in accordance with logical form, that is, not contradict itself, it may still contradict its object. Right. That makes sense. Like, it may be true that it doesn't, contradict the formal laws of logic, but that doesn't mean that what we're saying agrees with what we're actually talking about, like, specifically. Therefore, the merely logical criterion of truth, namely, the agreement of knowledge with the general and formal laws of the understanding and reason, is no doubt a conditio sine qua non, and hence the negative condition of all truth. Right, effectively, it has to abide by those rules, but it's just kind of a first principle that makes it something that simply logically is able to exist in this world, as opposed to actually telling us something about the thing specifically, or something like actually true of the object in particular. But logic can go no further than this. Right. And it has no touchstone for discovering error with regard not to form, but to content. Okay. I'm on board. I get it. I think. General logic breaks up the whole formal activity of the understanding and reason into its elements, and exhibits them as principles of all logical evaluation of our knowledge. This part of logic may therefore be called analytic. Hold on, I gotta read. General logic breaks up the whole formal activity of the understanding and reason into its elements. Okay, so we have understanding, we have reasoning, we have, things in our mind, concepts, stuff like that. And logic breaks it down into, like, very basic kind of building blocks and gives us very general rules. This part of logic may therefore be called analytic, and is at least a negative touchstone of truth. Right, meaning if the things don't meet these basic logical criterion, they cannot be true. Doesn't mean they are true in the more specific sense, but they must abide by the general, overarching rules of logic. Because all logic must first be examined and estimated as far as its form is concerned, according to these rules, before it is tested as to its content in order to determine whether it contains positive truth with regard to the object. But since the mere form of knowledge, however much it may be in agreement with logical laws, is far from being sufficient to establish the material, objective truth of that knowledge, no one can venture with logic alone to judge of objects, or to make any assertion about them. We must first, independently of logic, obtain trustworthy information about objects, we must first, independently of logic, obtain trustworthy information about objects, in order afterwards to attempt the application and connection of this information in a coherent whole according to logical laws. Or still better, in order merely to test this information by them. However, there is something so tempting in the possession of this specious art of giving to all our knowledge the form of understanding, however utterly poor and ignorant we may be in regard to its content, that general logic, which is merely a canon of judging, has been used as if it were an organon for the actual production of at least the semblance of objective assertions, and has thus been misused. So I think what he's saying here is like, yeah, we have canons of general understanding, but they can't actually tell us specifically about the world. And when you start to do that, like you start to try to use the principle of non-contradiction in order to like tell yourself specifically about something in the world, that's just like sophistry. Like you're not actually able to do anything with that. And I think Kant is taking the position like that's what a lot of probably metaphysics, he would say, can be sometimes. Now, general logic, when thus treated as an organon, is called dialectic. And so I think I remember this from Professor Gijsbers' lecture as well. the dialectic for Kant is actually like kind of a bad thing. It's like the misuse of a general principle of logic to use that in a way that, like I just described, to actually use it to try to extend your knowledge, when it really is like, I don't know. If you think about like the true-false tables that we have from not contemporary, but modern logic, like, you know, true and false equals, you know, true, doesn't necessarily. Well, is that correct? I don't know. True or false equals true. You can't use that to then like tell yourself something about the world, like I am 35 years old, or I am, 5 feet tall. If one of those is true, like the simple fact that true or false equals true, meaning if one of those statements is true, then that statement is true, doesn't actually answer the question of whether or not I am 35 or whatever I said, or 5 feet tall. You'd actually have to go figure that out. Then once you know that specifically, you could use you would have to use the general, maybe you wouldn't have to, but like, then it would be appropriate and possible to use the applicable logical rules in order to determine whether that's true or false. But I think what Kant is saying is like using those general, those basic principles to tell you stuff about the world is not helpful, and happens a lot. And I think that's what he would call dialectic, and he takes an issue with that. And I think he has like a pretty long section related to that, but probably not for a while. However different the meaning of this term may have been when the ancients used it for a science or art, we can safely gather from its actual use that for them dialectic was nothing but the logic of illusion. It was a sophistical art of giving to one's ignorance, nay, to one's intentional casuistry, the outward appearance of truth by imitating the method of thoroughness which logic always prescribes, and by using its topic as a cloak for any empty assertion. Now it may be noted, as a sure and very useful warning, that general logic, when regarded as an organon, is always a logic of illusion, that is, dialectical. For general logic teaches us nothing whatsoever with regard to the content of knowledge, but lays down only the formal conditions of an agreement with the understanding, and these conditions are totally indifferent as far as the objects are concerned. And I think, this kind of confirms my hypothesis, like the true or false equals true doesn't actually tell us anything about the specific statements. If the statements, end up corresponding to reality and we get a truth value for them, we can then apply the underlying logic, but the actual underlying logic can't tell us anything about the veracity of the statements. Therefore, any attempt at using general logic as a tool, organon, in order to extend and expand our knowledge, at least supposedly, can end in nothing but idle talk, where one can assert, or, if one prefers, deny anything one likes, with a certain semblance of plausibility. Such instruction is quite inadequate to the dignity of philosophy. Therefore, the title of dialectic has rather been added as a critique of dialectical illusion to logic, and it is in this sense that we use it here as well. All right, section 4. Of the division of transcendental logic into transcendental analytic and dialectic. In a transcendental logic, we isolate the understanding. As above, in the transcendental aesthetic, we isolated sensibility. And we take from our knowledge only that part of thought which has its origin solely in the understanding. Okay, so we're isolating the understanding and take from our knowledge only that part of thought. Okay, and like things we know, taking from things we know only things that are found solely in the understanding, meaning we're taking experience out of it and we're trying to figure out what we can know a priori in the understanding. Just like in the transcendental aesthetic, we were taking out all understanding and just trying to figure out like the a priori forms of the intuition. The use of pure knowledge has its condition that objects to which it can be applied are given in intuition. For without intuition, so this is what the understanding uses. The understanding uses intuitions. For without intuition, all our knowledge is without objects, and therefore remains entirely empty. Right, so, we can have ideas and stuff, but, like, ultimately you need, sense data, intuition, in order to actually provide you with, like, real understanding. That part of transcendental logic, therefore, which teaches the elements of pure knowledge of the understanding and the principles without which no object can be thought at all, is the transcendental analytic, and at the same time it is a logic of truth, for no knowledge can contradict it without losing at the same time all content, that is, all relation to any object, and therefore all truth. Gotta read that again. That part of transcendental logic, therefore, which teaches the elements of pure knowledge of the understanding, and the principles without which, so like the stuff that has to be there, without which no object can be thought, is the transcendental analytic. And at the same time, it is a logic of truth. Now, why is that? Because the things have to be true, because they are elements of our understanding that have to be there as the basis for understanding. Okay. And if they weren't true, then, effectively, they don't exist as that, I think. For no knowledge can contradict it without losing at the same time all content, that is, all relation to any object, and therefore all truth. But as it is very tempting to use this pure knowledge of the understanding and these principles by themselves, and even beyond the limits of experience, which alone can supply the matter, objects, to which those pure concepts of the understanding can be applied, the understanding runs the risk of making through mere sophisms a material use of merely formal principles of the pure understanding, and thus making judgments indiscriminately about objects which are not given to us, nay, which perhaps can never in any way be given. I'm going to read that again. It's a really long sentence. Okay. For no knowledge can contradict it without losing all, at the same time, all content, that is, all relation to any object, and therefore all truth. But, as it is very tempting to use this pure knowledge of the understanding and these principles by themselves, and even, we don't really know what those are yet, but okay, and even beyond the limits of experience, which alone can supply the matter, objects to which the pure concepts of understanding can be applied, the understanding runs the risk of making, without any sense data, without any intuitions, through mere sophism, a material use of the merely formal principles of the pure understanding, and thus making judgments indiscriminately about objects which are not given to us. Okay, I kind of understand. Nay, which perhaps can never in any way be given. So effectively, like, we're given these tools, like these basic building blocks of the understanding. I don't know what they are at this point, but, like, Kant's going to talk about them in, like, the forms. But, like, we cannot use those general concepts or those general requirements that are part of our understanding to tell us information about things we haven't experienced or to kind of fill in the gaps related to experience, because it's pure understanding, right? We need the sense data coupled with that in order to actually say something useful. As this transcendental analytic is properly meant to be only a canon for evaluating the empirical use of understanding, so it's a canon for evaluating the empirical use of the understanding, it is misused if we accept it as an organon of its general and unlimited use, and if we venture, with a pure understanding alone, to synthetically judge, affirm, and decide anything about objects in general. In this case, the use of pure understanding would become dialectical, meaning if we try to take these basic building blocks and extend it to particular circumstances or particular, things it doesn't necessarily apply to, it's going to become what Kant talked about, trying to extrapolate a particular concept from a general principle, and it's not possible. The second part of the transcendental logic must therefore form a critique of this dialectical illusion, and it is called transcendental dialectic, not as an art of producing such illusion dogmatically, an all too popular art with many metaphysical jugglers, but as a critique of the understanding and of reason with regard to their hyperphysical use, in order to lay bare the false illusion of their groundless pretensions, and to reduce reason's claims of discovering and expanding knowledge, which it assumes to achieve merely through transcendental principles, to merely evaluating the pure understanding and protecting it against sophistical semblance. Sorry, I have to read. But as a critique of the understanding and of reason with regard to their hyperphysical use, in order to lay bare the false illusion of their groundless pretensions, and to reduce reason's claims of discovering and expanding knowledge, which it assumes to achieve merely through transcendental principles, to merely evaluating the pure understanding, and protecting against sophistical semblance. Okay. So he wants to keep the understanding in its place and not overextend it into things that it can't really cover. Okay. So that brings us to the Transcendental Analytic, actually. Is this the one that's split into two? No, it's not. Oh, yeah, I forgot about this. Okay. So, yeah. We'll pick up with that next.